Do not adjust your set, as they used to say in the old world of television. You have not tuned into Americast, but today's newscast is going to be hosted by me, Justin Webb, and Marianna Spring, because Laura and Paddy are away on some kind of a winter weekend break or autumn weekend break. So, Marianna, it's an Americast takeover. We should make hay while the sun shines.
And we've got lots of American things to chat about, including Friday night's Donald Trump and President Zelensky meeting, which we'll get into. And then also this big news in the UK, Justin, about Prince Andrew.
Yeah, all that and more to come on this edition of Newscast.
Hello, it is Marianna. I'm in what we on Americast would call the worldwide headquarters, but I think when I'm on Newscast, I'm supposed to just call it the studio.
Yeah, and we should explain the annoying in-joke, and it does annoy people, which is why we keep on making it, which is that our American colleagues are upset and annoyed, as you'd expect them to be. Imagine how Donald Trump would react when we say that the headquarters of Americast is actually in London, England, but of course it isn't. Anyway, that's the point about Americast. And we are going to talk about quite a few American things during the course of this edition, but it is very much Newscast that Marianna and I are bringing to you today. And we're going to be talking about news that is not necessarily American, although all of it has some American link, specifically that Trump-Zelensky meeting that took place. So we're going to talk to the BBC's Ukraine correspondent, James Waterhouse, about what in Ukraine they make of it. But let's start with Prince Andrew and this statement that came out last night. I'll read you a bit of it. In discussion with the King and my immediate and wider family, we have concluded the continued accusations about me distract from the work of His Majesty and the royal family. I've decided, as I always have, to put my duty to my family and country first. I stand by my decision 5 years ago to stand back from public life. And then he says, we feel I must now go a step further. I will therefore no longer use my title or the honours which have been conferred on me. And he also says, as I've said previously, I vigorously deny the accusations against me. And I suppose the first question, Marianna, arising from that is whether, other than the optics, whether anything's actually changed.
I know it's quite interesting that now appears to be the tipping point at which Andrew, along with the royal family, have decided, OK, actually, reputationally, this is not doing us any favours. There have been this slew of headlines for years now, if we're honest, that have focused on Andrew's relationship, friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, who we chat about a lot on Newscast, and, you know, who is someone who lots of powerful people have been associated with. But I think Andrew in particular, his connection, not least because he is a member of the royal family, is one that has been constantly scrutinised. People might remember he did that interview with Newsnight with the BBC back in 2019. And then now, most recently, there have been these kind of new, I'd say this drip of information coming out, because not only has there been quite a lot of discussion about Jeffrey Epstein, because people have been wanting Donald Trump to release more information about who was connected to Jeffrey Epstein, which brings us back to Americast, but also Virginia Giuffre, who is the woman who accused Prince Andrew of being involved in trafficking and other things with Jeffrey Epstein, which he, as you say, Justin, vigorously denies. Her book, she died this year, and the book that she wrote before she died is coming out, and there are all these extracts again about Prince Andrew. So you can imagine, and I'm, if you're the king, you're sitting there thinking, oh, we've got another, goodness knows how many months, years of these kinds of stories coming out. And it's worth saying that these are really serious allegations and serious stories. And I imagine that's why they've reached this point.
I mean, it's worth breaking down what the various things are that have brought them to this point, it seems to me. And one of them, you're absolutely right, is this book by Virginia Giuffre, which is coming out. There are excerpts already people may have read, but the actual book itself coming out very soon. And it looks as if it is going to be even more layered detail about individual incidents that involve Prince Andrew. That's the allegation that she's making, but also other people potentially as well. So that's one side of it. There is another side to it, though, as well, and that is this, that he was very clear in his Newsnight interview, this infamous interview that he gave back in 2019. He was very clear that when he was pictured with Epstein in 2010, that was the end of it. You remember there's this picture of the two of them together in New York, walking near Central Park. And he said in the interview, he said it very clearly, that was it. I didn't have contact with him again. Now it has emerged in emails released in the United States that actually not only did he have contact with him again, so what he said to Newsnight was not true, it seems, but also the contact that he had involved phrases in the email, really damaging phrases like "one day we'll play again,"
Yeah, keep in close touch, and we'll play some more soon. Which doesn't seem to be indicative of a non-existent friendship.
No, exactly, and I think the risk for the royal family and the suspicion in the royal family is that that's not going to be the only moment where he's caught out. Actually, he's said something that at the very least seems not to be true, and that there may be other things too. And the other thing I think, which I think then calls into question the judgment of the palace, and this is what those who are palace watchers who are a little more skeptical of the palace than perhaps some of those who are very close to it say, which is that could they not have seen all this coming? And should they have done all of this earlier? Not least because this goes to our American stuff, which we've often talked about on Americast. There is a real political head of steam now for stuff to be released that hasn't been released. And there's a ton of documentation about the whole Epstein episode that is still under wraps. And as you know, Marianna, one of the things we often talk about is the way in which Donald Trump is under pressure from his own supporters to release this stuff, because he kind of suggested during the election campaign that it would be easily done. And his attorney general said at one stage that it was on her desk, didn't she? And she was going to let it all out. And it hasn't happened. And I mean, it just seems to me that as the Republican Party fractures, which it will do over the next couple of years, because Donald Trump will be on the wane. Let's assume he doesn't run again for the sake of argument, and he's not allowed to, of course. So there are all sorts of ways in which this stuff, this Epstein stuff, it seems to me, is going to explode onto the public scene, and the palace really ought to see that coming. And I suppose now, in acting now, they kind of are seeing it coming.
Yeah, it's interesting because exactly like you say, Justin, there's all kinds of evidence that exists, emails, correspondence, the book we were talking about,
flight manifests.
Yeah, exactly. And people pore over this stuff, as we know, because it kind of interests them, because it shocks them. And it's worth underlining that lots of this evidence shows relationships or connections between Jeffrey Epstein and, say, Andrew or whoever it might be. It doesn't, in and of itself, substantiate the allegations of wrongdoing which have been made by other people. And I think what's difficult here is that you have the people who, pop up in these emails and books and whatever else saying, well, yeah, okay, fine, I kind of was friends with him, but it doesn't mean I did anything bad. And then lots of members of the public, and particularly people on social media, the world that I investigate most of the time, saying, well, hang on a second, why were you still connected to this person? Why were you happy to frequent the same places or be in touch with them if you knew or had any inkling that they were doing bad stuff, or you knew that they had, these very, very serious accusations had been levelled against them, or they'd, been charged, etc., etc. And I think that is what, Donald Trump, as we've chatted about lots, has struggled with, people resurfacing pictures of him with Jeffrey Epstein. Again, he very, very, very strongly says, we fell out. I had nothing to do with the bad stuff that he did, etc. But that doesn't stop the very rabid online space saying, well, why are all these powerful people connected to other powerful people who do bad things? Because when it comes to Jeffrey Epstein, and the reason why people are so, I don't know if obsessed is the right word, but are so interested in this, is because it's really, really shocking, and because it feels symptomatic of very rich and powerful people being allowed to do things kind of unaccountably, and all kind of being connected to one another, which very much fits into the conspiratorial way of looking at the world. And lots of the conspiracy theories go way beyond what the evidence tells us. But there are obviously examples of where power has been abused here.
I think that's exactly the point. It's one of those areas, probably not the only one, where there are people who make wild accusations and believe in things that just aren't true, conspiracy things. But there are also people who broadly agree with them, who are perfectly well aware of the difference between truth and fiction and just want to find it out. And interestingly, in America, it's now a cross-party thing. So you've got kind of people, we've got real conspiracy theorists. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene has been a conspiracy theorist. I think it is fair to say of her, the Republican congresswoman. I don't think anyone could really seriously argue with that, but is actually now very much on this stuff in the mainstream. And there are people on the left. I was talking actually earlier today, I'm doing my day job on the Today program, talking to Gloria Allred, who is the attorney, the very famous attorney, women's rights campaigner, who works for some of the victims of Jeffrey Epstein. And, you know, there is this right across the board sense that there is more to this than meets the eye. And there obviously is, too. I mean, it's a simple fact that he got off from his initial charge when he actually went to jail for a little bit down in Florida. The initial charge seemed to people to be oddly light. It was for soliciting for prostitution of a minor. It was one count, and he had a very lenient sentence. And there are questions about that still swirl about. There are also questions about Ghislaine Maxwell and what's going on with her. She's now in a much easier prison to be in than the one she was in before. She's serving 20 years. She'd obviously dearly like to get out. There has been talk as well, hasn't there, Marianna, of deals being done and of her spilling the beans, perhaps, or maybe not spilling the beans, and in that way securing her own freedom. So, I mean, there's just a ton more to come.
Yeah, and when we ask this question of, well, hang on a second, why have the royal family waited until now for this to happen? Why has it happened in this way? Because also it's worth saying that they could have gone about this in a very different way, couldn't they, Justin? They could have had to kind of go through Parliament and have a bit of this sort of show of saying, actually, we don't want Andrew to have his titles anymore. But they've allowed him to... And as you read out in that statement, you know, him saying things like, I have decided, as I always have, to put my duty and to my family and country first. They've allowed him to have his say and to step back sort of his own, well, certainly before he was pushed. I think there are two interesting things. One is that it is that point of, would it have made a difference if, you know, after the Newsnight interview or after, you know, even 2 or 3 years ago when there were other bits of information appearing about Epstein and all kinds of other accusations being levelled at Andrew, would it have been better to have made those decisions back then? And I think it's important to remember that he is a member of this family. Like, we're talking about his brother, like he's going and talking to his brother about it's not like, you know, your employee in the traditional sense, although obviously it's a very different type of family. And then also when we think about, well, will this actually make a difference going forward? Does it really separate the royal family from further accusations that come out? And if I'm really honest, I think, and maybe this is because I am very much tainted by how stuff unfolds on social media, but I don't think, you know, I don't think a decision to sort of distance the royal family from Andrew in this way now will change that. It makes people think that powerful people like royals are complicit in bad things, really, if that's something that you're going to think in the first place. I guess people might... I guess it could have some kind of impact, but again, you might point to, well, why didn't you do this ages ago? So I don't know whether almost the horse has bolted, really, in terms of the reputational impact, or at least it means that the royal family, from their point of view, I imagine if you were someone working within their kind of comms and PR team, you think, well, at least we don't have to keep explaining how what Andrew does is kind of his own thing, because we sort of can do that now.
And the other thing's this other book. I mean, we talked about Virginia Giuffre's book, but there's another book, isn't there, too, by Andrew Lowry. And I confess I haven't looked at it, but it suggests, and again, Andrew Lowry was on the Today program this morning, saying that, you know, there is, I mean, his point is that all of the former Duke, all of the prince's financial affairs are strange. He didn't quite use the word strange. He actually used another tougher word, but I won't, because, again, these things are deniable. But the fact is that there is something odd about the way in which Prince Andrew seems to be so wealthy, and his family as well, and that also bears looking into. And that's absolutely, this has kind of nothing to do with Jeffrey Epstein. It's a completely new can of worms that the royal family, again, Marianna, to an extent, maybe saw it coming and realized, goodness, there's an awful lot here that we just would prefer not to be attached to us.
Yeah, and you mentioned, accusations about Andrew's finances. There's also all this stuff about this alleged Chinese spy. People might remember. So Andrew withdrew from this from the family events, the royal family events last Christmas, because he was linked to this alleged Chinese spy. He was named in a high court judgment, and his office came out to say, look, nothing sensitive had ever been discussed with this person, Yang Tengbo, also known as Chris Yang, who was an advisor on Andrew's business ventures. But anyway, it all of these things you can imagine, if you're sitting inside Buckingham Palace or whatever you do, if you're the royal family, you're thinking, oh, another one? It's like Brenda from Bristol. Different people remember that. And it is worth reiterating with all of these things, whether it is the accusations around Jeffrey Epstein or and Virginia Giuffre, or about this alleged Chinese spy, or about the financial stuff, that Andrew denies all wrongdoing on all of these counts. Okay, Justin, we're back on even more familiar territory, perhaps, Americast territory, because we're going to talk about what happened last night between Donald Trump and Zelensky, and then also what has been happening this week between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. And there is no one better to talk to us about all of this than Ukraine correspondent James Waterhouse. So this is like Newscast, Americast, Ukrainecast, crossover fusion. Hi, James.
Hi, Marianna. Hi, Justin.
How are you?
Yeah, fine, thanks. As you say, it's all been very familiar this week, hasn't it? When you look at, Mr. Zelensky in front of his American counterpart, forcing a smile, smothering him with compliments, and
Flashbacks
leaving
to that,
with nothing.
Yeah, flashbacks to that Oval Office showdown, which was pretty extraordinary, really, earlier this year.
Yeah, I mean, it's a world away from that, and I think just how things have improved is a reflection of Europe and Ukraine's strategy. They have gone for full Operation Ring Kiss. They've gone there, bent the knee, kissed the ring, and smothered Donald Trump with praise. Because, as reflected this week, with Europe coming up with this so-called defence roadmap, where they've had to form a plan, or the European Commission has, to increase defence spending, create land corridors, air bases, a so-called drone wall by 2030. They're trying to show, look, we can make our weapons, we can pay for them, but it's going to take so much time, and that's not yet with the complete approval of all European governments. And then you've got poor old Volodymyr Zelenksy in the middle, still trying to keep the spotlight on his war. And he is engaging with Donald Trump. They clearly have a closer relationship. He's still using transactional language like, look, we'll give you some drones in exchange for some Tomohawk missiles that would allow us to strike seriously deep inside Russia. But here we are again with the slightest bit of communication from Vladimir Putin, and he's back to that fence saying, well, I may do, I may not, it might escalate, it might not. And here we are preparing for another potential US-Russia summit.
So just James, just take us back a couple of steps then. What did the Ukrainians think was going to happen at the White House this time round? What were they hoping for? What were they aiming for?
Start of the week, Justin, they were hoping to go to meet Donald Trump directly, who seemingly instigated this meeting fresh off the back of securing a ceasefire in the Middle East. They were hoping he would give a sign-off on the supply of these US Tomahawk cruise missiles that can strike hundreds of kilometers, more than 1,000 kilometers inside Russia. And Ukraine, at this point, has successfully been striking Russian oil refineries. And they were hoping to sort of extend that, to extend the pain to Russians who are in some parts of the country, not all, not in major cities, queuing for petrol, seeing prices increase. They want to also strike military sites like air bases. And in a sort of collective effort to put the pressure on the Kremlin to talk, they were hoping to see that, step change in American support for Ukraine off the back of the improvement we've seen. And yet on Thursday, Vladimir Putin calls Donald Trump, we're told, according to the US president, where he says, look, it'll change little on the battlefield, and all giving Ukraine Tomahawk missiles would do is damage our own relations And you wouldn't want that, would you? I presume. I mean, that's what you would imagine the thrust of that 2 hour conversation was. And almost immediately, Donald Trump was, you could see he was energized by that. And he's gone back to this neutral stance. And I can guarantee you, Ukrainians will be looking at this and thinking, right, okay, the US president's called it productive. For whom? You know, we're now having our infrastructure hit once more in autumn. We're having forced blackouts. This war we're still having to withstand at a huge cost. And for Russia, it buys it more time.
I was talking to a member of the Ukrainian parliament, James, who was saying that her frustration was actually not so much aimed at Donald Trump, although she does think he's useless, basically. And she very much regrets that he's going to Budapest and meeting with Putin without a ceasefire in place, same as that meeting, that last meeting they had in Alaska, where people were saying, well, hang on a second, why don't you get the ceasefire before the meeting started? So all of that annoyed her. But the thing that annoyed her more, which was, I found quite striking, and you probably won't because you're aware of this, but I just thought it was really interesting that the people she was really annoyed with were the Europeans, because she said, you're not taking all of this stuff seriously. You're not freeing up all the money, the Russian money that's in Europe and could be used to buy weapons. You're not properly having embargoes. You're still buying oil, et cetera, et cetera. She felt this was a moment that the Europeans have got to be a bit tougher and just, put the Trump business to one side.
You both know better than I. Donald Trump looks at things in a very transactional way, and he's pointing out to the European bloc as a whole, why do you want me to help you as much as I can if you are still buying Russian oil and gas? And we're seeing, the growth of the populist far right in some countries who certainly, the likes of Slovakia and Hungary, do not want to stop buying Russian oil and gas. And so that undoubtedly is tempering America's support. And as far as Ukraine is concerned, they do feel, this is a country that has been at war, that has been attacked by Russia since 2014. And they have been part of Europe throughout that, as Ukraine always has been. And they feel that there has not just been inaction, but not enough pro-action ahead of what was widely seen as an escalation with the full-scale invasion. And I sat on this remote press conference this week where Kaja Kallas, the EU's foreign policy chief, announced this security dome, this drone wall where they would defend Europe's eastern flank against drone incursions, airspace violations, where they would look to increase manufacturing. And you just think, if you're a Ukrainian watching this, it all sounds very good and well. There are still huge question marks over where the money comes from, whether there's duplication with NATO, which is operationally responsible for European defence. They claim there was no duplication. But yeah, there is a simmering resentment, frustration, I think I'm doing it down there slightly, over Europe's inability still to plug the gap where Donald Trump has sort of laid down the gauntlet and said, look, Europe, step up.
It's interesting, James, because I mean, you already spend too much of your time doing this, but when we're trying to sort of like psychoanalyze Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, Volodomyr Zelenksy, it's like, it feels like there's been this kind of constant oscillation, or flip-flop is maybe too strong, maybe not, when it comes to their positions. Particularly, I would say, Donald Trump's relationship with both men and, how he feels about Putin. And on the one hand, he'll kind of say, oh, basically, he's kind of annoying me. And then he'll kind of be like, oh, actually, no, we spoke on the phone. He's not annoying me anymore. How much has that position changed since Donald Trump became president? Like, where are we in terms of the timeline of their falling out, not falling out?
I know. I would agree. I think it's like a pendulum, right?
Yeah,
and
that's good.
In January, that pendulum was extreme. We saw Donald Trump come in. We saw Zelensky go meet him in New York, where he was trying to impress his case. And before that, under the Biden administration for Ukraine, it had been like a gradual yield, where Ukraine would ask for fighter jets, tanks. America would say no, or the West would say no, we're worried about an escalation. Russia would play to that, but then it would eventually give in, provide Ukraine with these kind of weapons. But the simmering frustration was the speed and scale at which this Western help arrived. Under Donald Trump, it is this pendulum where you had that bust up earlier this year, and watching that from Kyiv with Ukrainian colleagues, the gravity of it was deeply felt because we didn't really know what the Trump administration would bring. We knew it would be different to Biden, but seeing a deterioration in such a dramatic way in the White House was going to have far-reaching consequences, not just for Ukraine's immediate fight, but also the course of these peace talks. How would they go? And that pendulum, under a huge amount of diplomatic effort, has become less extreme, but it is still swinging. And I was looking at Zelensky's face in that, that White House gathering with all the press opposite Donald Trump, and he is having to still adopt this tactic of flattery, and he's thanking him, and I have no idea how he is still doing it, having to go there and thank for his efforts so far, the wanting of peace, because for reasons discussed, it is American intelligence, military expertise. It's military might in terms of long-distance weaponry and armored vehicles. It's all of these things together that make it a superpower, and why Europe, while it's come a long way with Ukraine now leading the way, there's still a chasm between the two, and it's that chasm which is forcing Volodymyr Zelensky to just swallow his frustrations and try to keep Donald Trump on side. And I think that is the best he can hope for at the moment. What I don't want to do is dismiss the reasons why Russia might be coming to the table. Yes, it's to buy time. Putin has shown he wants to keep fighting. But we are talking in autumn, where the ground is soft, the frost will come in. His offensive for this year is over. And we have seen, yes, towns reduced to rubble, but no major towns or cities have been taken once more. And so when you look at the human cost for both sides, but more so for Russia, some analysis puts it as 5-1. There are other forces, not least with its economy, that could be taking Vladimir Putin back to the landline. But I think the main reason I think Ukrainians are bright-eyed about this is that he just wants to improve relations with the US whilst taking Ukrainian territory as what he sees as an acceptable cost.
Yeah. I do wonder, though, whether Trump is in a stronger position because of what's happened in the Middle East. And you can, let's not fall into the trap. I don't think we are likely to do this, of just assuming that Donald Trump has waved a magic wand in the Middle East and everything's settled, because it's obviously not. But he has achieved things in the Middle East. And you could argue, couldn't you, James, that he's achieved them by putting real pressure on people. Being willing to apply that pressure, specifically on Benjamin Netanyahu after the Israeli attack on a Hamas target in Doha, in Qatar, in a nation that Donald Trump is very close to in a business way and in other ways as well. But also more widely, that he was willing to put pressure, it seems, behind the scenes on Turkey and potentially on Egypt as well. And there's a sense that of Donald Trump that he always chickens out of everything. But actually, on this occasion, maybe he didn't. And maybe there could be some way in which Putin begins to think, maybe with me too, he won't chicken out eventually, and he might supply the Tomahawks and then do any number of other things that Russia would be upset by.
I think in principle, he has every reason to feel like he holds the cards, because you're right, it's that broad pressure that needs to be imposed on the leaders of the day to make a ceasefire and an eventual peace agreement hold. I'm not going to try and draw parallels between the different natures of the conflicts, but the same principle applies, right? He's going to use his political and military leverage and say, look, enough is enough. I think with Russia's war in Ukraine, you've got two foes who still believe they are in the fight. And so, yes, it will take pressure. Ukraine wants to see a whole lot more of it put on Russia with the supply of Tomahawks and with a meaningful guarantee that America, along with the West, would step in if Russia was to have another go. But that's where the same principle, that kind of parallel ends, because there is a practical reality. If you listen to what Trump was saying yesterday, he was saying, why don't we finish? Why don't we freeze the contact, the fighting on the current front lines, and let men go home to their families and stop killing each other? It's up for Zelensky and Putin to sort this out, but there's a lot of bad blood between the two. Those pose huge practical questions. It's not just a front line. It's swathes of territory. It's an enormous land corridor held up by drones that swarm the sky, that keep pockets of soldiers trapped underground where there is a huge death rate. You've got Russian forces on the outskirts of some Ukrainian towns. How do you suddenly click a finger and stop that without some kind of military blueprint? And so Donald Trump is clearly moving things along in trying to get Ukraine and Russia to engage. But it won't just be enough, you would argue, on recent evidence, for him to just chair a face-to-face between Putin and Zelensky. It will take more to just both make Zelensky work to his vision for peace and to make Putin think twice before trying it again.
Just quickly before you go, James, but something that we've chatted about quite a lot on Americast is, to this point about Donald Trump seeing himself as the broker of world peace, how he would quite like to win the Nobel Peace Prize, which he has made no secret of. And we have had quite an interesting question from Ian in Maidstone, who suggests that we might be talking about the wrong Trump. So Ian asked, "Hi Americast /Newscast /Ukrainecast. As Melania Trump appears to be making headway in her bid to return home kidnapped Ukrainian children, should she be nominated for next year's Nobel Peace Prize? What would that do to domestic arrangements in the White House?" Interesting, though, because she has actually been, James, pretty vocal in, like, this is an issue that she's sort of taken upon herself, and she doesn't tend to get as stuck in. She does occasionally on some issues. We've chatted about it before, Justin, like, for example, she's spoken about abortion and abortion rights, but this is something where she's written some quite kind of powerful letters about how important it is that kids are returned back home.
I would love to know what conversations they have in private over the merits of supporting Ukraine and what she makes of that invasion. What I would say is, yes, her role has been unusual, and she has secured the release of, I think, 8 Ukrainian children being returned to their families, and one Russian child has gone the other way. But this is also a double-edged sword, because that's 8 out of an estimated 20,000 missing Ukrainian children. So yes, it could be the start of something more. We've seen it with prisoner of war exchanges. There could be a deeper cooperation there through the US First Lady. But if you went on, Russian state TV, they were talking this up as well, the return of that Russian child. And Melania Trump may well be the figurehead that represents improving relations between Russia and the US. So yes, of course, the return of abducted children is a welcome sight. But if you're Ukraine and you're looking at the First Lady playing this role, it could lead to, with such small numbers of children being returned so far, the worry is that could just simply lead to a political bridge over their heads at the expense of their future security.
Okay, that's it. This takeover episode of Newscast is over. Americast, of course, is the place where Marianna and I can be found often, along with our US colleagues, and do give Americast a try if you haven't beforehand, but otherwise...
This was your taster, this was your flavour of Americast.
Yes, exactly.
And we hope we've convinced you.
If you like the sound of us, do, and if you don't like the sound of us, do anyway, because it might be better with the other people as well. I think that's probably it for now, though, Marianna.
It is. Bye.
Bye.